All right, today we're talking about ecosystem ecology, focusing on things like biodiversity, conservation, climate change, energy and nutrient cycling. So let's dive in. So an ecosystem, remember, is a system of interacting biotic and abiotic factors. So we started with organism. That's a single individual of a species. Then we got to population, which was a group of organisms of the same species. Community looks at all the different living organisms and their interactions. And then with ecosystems, we add those abiotic or non-living factors. So when we look at ecosystems, we're focusing on nutrient cycling, energy cycling, biomes, the effect of human interventions, conservation, and a lot of those more broad ideas. So we're going to start with this idea of energy flow in the ecosystem, because remember, a property of life is that all living things need energy. And ultimately, all of this energy comes from the sun. The entire globe basically is solar powered, or for some of our non-living components, they're more thermal or or not bio, but geothermal powered, things like that. However, all living things are powered by the sun. So the energy is going to flow from the sun to what we call producers. The producers are then eaten by the consumers, and both producers and consumers are broken down once they die by things called detritivores. And so the energy kind of cycles. Additionally, though, that energy can be released as heat. So this energy comes in, it cycles between all living organisms, and then it also escapes as heat. Because remember, we can't create or destroy energy. That's part of the law of conservation of energy. So we just all, as living things, have to find a way to make use of the energy available to us that's coming from the sun. Well, we're also going to talk about how matter cycles as well. So as I mentioned before, this term producer, in science we tend to use the term autotroph a little bit more. Auto meaning self and troph meaning relating to food. So this is a self-feeder. These organisms can convert the energy in sunlight into a usable chemical form of energy. So they're converting solar radiation into chemicals, and we call these chemical sugars. Things like plants and cyanobacteria, anything that can photosynthesize can do this. They turn that sunlight energy and carbon dioxide into glucose or sugar. Then we have our heterotrophs. These are our consumers, anything that eats a producer or eats another consumer. They have to consume another organism in order to get their energy. This is most of what we think of when we think of animals and fungi and bacteria. So these are our herbivores, the ones that eat plants, our carnivores, the ones that only eat other organisms like animals, or I guess animals, not like animals. Omnivores, which can eat plants or animals, and then detritivores are the ones that break down dead and decaying matter. We call this detritus or detritus. I've heard both ways of pronouncing it. These are things like your fungi, your mold, your bacteria, your scavengers, and they play a crucial role in the ecosystem. They have to be able to break this matter down, or the nutrients won't get back into the ecosystem for us to be able to use in future organisms. So you can see our producers are down here at the bottom. They are the ultimate start of the energy. They get the energy from the sun and they turn it into a form that can finally be used by life. Then we have what are those called primary consumers. This is our herbivore stage. Then we start getting into our omnivores and our carnivores with our secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumers. So when we want to look at this energy flow throughout ecosystems, we often discuss them in terms of the trophic structure. Troph, remember, means relating to food or nutrition, so this is the structure of how we get food energy throughout the ecosystem. And the structure indicates the position and the role that the organism occupies in a bigger food chain or food web. And we've been learning about food chains since we were in elementary school. It's this organism is eaten by that organism, which is then eaten by this other organism, et cetera, et cetera. We often show this trophic structure as a pyramid for a couple different reasons. Mainly, it shows us how the energy is being transferred. And at every level, we get a little bit less energy and less energy in that structural group. So the producers have the most energy available for other organisms to use, which is kind of important because they're the ones that end up feeding the rest of every organism on the planet, so they better have the most energy, otherwise we'll run out of energy for the organisms higher up. Then our herbivores that eat the producers have the next highest level of energy. Omnivores or omnivores, can eat the producers or the herbivores, so they have a little bit less energy, so on and so forth. So this loss of energy at higher levels is due to a few things. First, you have an organism that's going to be eating their food. Well, some of that is going to go into growing their own biomass, growing their own bodies, moving their own bodies, things like that. Some of that is going to get released in the feces or released back into the environment, and the organism never uses it. And then you have other parts that are going to be used by the organism in something called cellular respiration, us getting energy from our food. That takes its own toll and use of energy as well. And then on top of that, we're going to release some of that energy as heat because we're living organisms producing work with that energy. So there's a lot of ways that that energy is not available to be used by the next level. We're using it, we're releasing it as heat, things like that. So really, only this part down here at the bottom, this new biomass, only about that much is going to be available for the next organism that's going to come in and eat that caterpillar or that leaf or whatever it might be. The rest is not going to be usable in the ecosystem any longer. So I've mentioned this term biomass. It's basically just the amount of living organic material in an ecosystem. And we often portray those in their own style of pyramids. And once again, it makes a lot of sense that our producers are going to have the most biomass. They have to have the most available energy and mass for the higher levels to consume. And as you get higher and higher, you get less and less biomass available for the next level to consume. So it's similar to the idea of how the higher levels of consumers contain less overall energy. They also contain less overall mass for a similar reason. So when we look at that pyramid and we think about how nutrients and energy are being passed from level to level, we come to this kind of an issue that humans have unfortunately been a big cause in creating in the environment. And that is this idea of biological accumulation and magnification. So pollution, or humans dumping toxic waste products into the environment, has been a problem basically since humans have started to do any kind of industrialization or altering chemicals, things like that. So these toxins that get dumped into the environment cannot be metabolized. They can't be used for food. They can't be used and broken down by other organisms. They are often toxic as well. So if they can't be used, either the body will release it back into the environment, or it can accumulate, bioaccumulate within the tissues of the organism over time. So sometimes there's certain chemicals that we eat that then kind of remain in our cells. They get taken up by fatty deposits or other things like that, and they just kind of hang around in our bodies. Well, the more of this toxin that I eat, in theory, the more of these toxins that will then accumulate within my cells. So if I get eaten by some other organism, my cells will have increasingly higher levels, concentration of this particular compound, which makes me more and more toxic to be eaten by other organisms. So there we get into this idea of biomagnification, where not only am I consuming toxins from my environment and they are being taken up into my cells, but these toxins get more and more potent or more and more concentrated as you move up these levels. Because the zooplankton take in a little bit of this toxin from the environment, but if it accumulates in them, and the next level, the cod, are eating tons of zooplankton, they're getting a more concentrated, a more powerful dose of that toxin. And then it accumulates within their bodies. When the salmon then eat the cod, they're getting an even bigger dose and it's going to accumulate in their bodies. And then when it gets into humans, this particular example of PCBs, they end up accumulating in our fatty deposits, often found in breast milk, which has a high fat quantity, which is then getting passed on to our offspring. So this idea of biomagnification can become a problem when the compounds we are taking in have a toxic effect on the body, such as something like mercury. If you take in too much mercury, you can end up with a lot of brain problems down the road. So on top of energy cycling, we also cannot create or destroy matter. We just can cycle that matter. So we do something called nutrient or chemical cycling throughout ecosystems as well. You might have heard these called biogeochemical cycles. Things like the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, etc. These allow ecosystems to use and reuse the same chemicals required for life rather than having to synthesize them from basic building blocks every single time, or really we can't make more atoms. They're just here and we have to learn how to cycle them between forms. So this all ties back to this idea of conservation of energy and mass. We're constantly cycling this material through different forms because we can't make it and we can't get rid of it. So if we look at this figure to the right, let's talk our way through it. So there's some abiotic reservoir, meaning a non-living reservoir for the particular nutrient that we're looking at. Oceans and streams and lakes and ponds for rivers, or for water. Things like the soil or the atmosphere for nitrogen, rocks for phosphorus, things like that. So our producers are able to take those nutrients from the non-living environment around them, and they're able to turn those into some kind of form that is usable for all other life. So they'll take it from the environment and convert it into a form usable by consumers. The consumers then will eat the producers and take up that nutrient. They'll put it into their own body. Sometimes they will release it back into the environment in the form of waste products, such as the nitrogen in urea when animals pee. Or what can happen is they can die, and then their bodies, whether that's the producer or the consumer, get broken down by decomposers, and they often put the nutrients back into the abiotic reservoir. So we're constantly taking it up through the producer, putting things back into the abiotic reservoir, or that producer is being consumed by consumers, but eventually it all gets put back into the environment. So an example of this is the carbon cycle. You've probably seen this a bunch of times. Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, turns it into sugars that plants use for their bodies and to feed all other organisms. It gets eaten by organisms. Those organisms get eaten. But then these organisms will go through cellular respiration. They'll break down their food for energy, and as a result, they breathe out CO2, putting CO2 back into the abiotic reservoir, the atmosphere. Additionally, all of these living things can die and decompose and become part of the carbon in the soil. Some of these organisms will then turn into a source of carbon that we can then burn, either through wood or through fossil fuels, things like that, and that puts that carbon back into the atmosphere as well. So we have a bunch of carbon sources. This is any biotic or abiotic component of the ecosystem that can put carbon back into the environment. Things like organisms performing respiration, that's a carbon source. Burning of fossil fuels, that's a carbon source. Disturbing the soil can often release stored carbon as well. So when we deforest, not only are we taking away those trees and we're often burning them for energy or releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere somehow from the trees themselves, but the disturbance of the soil itself will often release a lot of CO2 back into the atmosphere as well. But luckily, we also have carbon sinks. These are natural structures that can absorb carbon dioxide. Things like the ocean and bodies of water, those are big sinks where they absorb carbon dioxide. The soil, as I just mentioned, building up the actual physical bodies of living things is taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to build the structure of their bodies. So living organisms, particularly forests and grasslands with a lot of producers, they take a lot of carbon and sink it into their bodies. So here's a couple other examples of biogeochemical cycles. We have the phosphorus cycle, which is important for building our DNA, building structures like our bones. We have the nitrogen cycle, which is also important to building all of our proteins and our DNA. These are really important elements as far as living organisms go. The nitrogen cycle is very interesting because most of the nitrogen is in the atmosphere. The atmosphere is over 70% nitrogen, so most of what you're breathing in constantly is nitrogen in the form of N2, which has a triple bond between it, I believe, or a double bond. I can't remember exactly, but it has multiple chemical bonds between the two nitrogens, and that is very, very hard to break to get the nitrogen in a usable form. There's a couple ways that happens. Actually, you can end up with lightning that strikes in the atmosphere and breaks apart this the bond between the nitrogen, and puts it into the soil. Or you can have bacteria that can actually convert that atmospheric nitrogen into a usable form in the soil. They'll put it in the form of nitrates or things like that. Then plants take up that nitrogen into their bodies. Organisms like consumers can eat the nitrogen from the plants. When they die, they can go back into the soil and get broken down by the decomposers. Another really interesting thing is that there are some plants who have these little nodules on their roots that are filled with denitrifying bacteria. So these little pockets have the bacteria that can turn that nitrogen from the atmosphere into a usable form. So as a result, they are actually increasing the nutrient value in the soil by growing in there. Things like peas and beans. So often when people have to rest an area of land in their crop rotations, they might plant beans or other types of legumes in that area to help re-nutrify that soil. Now, moving a little bit away from this idea of energy and nutrient cycling, are biomes. This is the level right under ecosystem as far as organizational levels. Or, I'm sorry, right above ecosystems. So this groups together ecosystems based on their climate, their vegetation type, their physical environment. And most of these biomes are actually determined based on their latitude on the planet, because this is going to determine the amount of sunlight they get, which in turn determines their climate. So some of the terrestrial biomes you may have heard of are things like chaparral, the one that we're living in, the desert, the taiga, the savanna, tropical rainforests, things like that. There are also aquatic biomes. These ones obviously are not going to be defined by how much sunlight they get or how much precipitation. They are more often determined by their salinity levels. How salty is that water? So we have things like wetlands, streams, coral reefs, estuaries, all of that fun stuff. So when we look at these biomes, we can see how the latitude, their position horizontally on the planet, determines which biomes you're going to see more often. So in the case of the equator, that central line that divides the planet in half horizontally, we see a lot of this bright green biome. That's the tropical rainforest. The equator gets relatively stable amounts of sunlight all year long, and they end up with high levels of precipitation. So these are very wet, very bright, very hot areas of the planet. So you can have tons of biodiversity, tons of different species of plants and animals growing there. As we move a little higher, we see that we get this red biome that continues to pop up. Similarly, in the same spot down below, we see that red biome, and that's the desert. These areas often have very low rainfall with lots of sun exposure, so they cannot produce as many organisms because there's not enough water to support them. Go a little bit higher or lower, and you get this really dark green area. That's going to be your taiga. Here you have a lot of conifers and higher mountain areas, a little bit less precipitation than lower, and they have very extremes of sunlight. They'll have periods where the sun shines for the majority of the day, and then periods where the sun is hardly up throughout the day. And then you have things like the tundra, where it's really characterized by lesser vegetation and permafrost. You have areas that are just ice sheets like Antarctica and Greenland. You have savanna, which are grasslands. So that's an idea of how biomes are influenced by their latitude. So another thing I mentioned was climate. So the definition of climate is it's the prevailing weather of a region over a long period of time. So when you look at the weather forecast, that is not the climate, that's just what's happening this week. But then overall, when you look at California, we are an area whose climate is characterized by relatively low levels of precipitation and high levels of sunlight. And that's all going to be able to affect what can live here and thrive and survive here. So climate change is one of the big issues that we're dealing with today, in the sense that there's a large long-term change to the different climates that have been, around for forever on the planet. Thought to be increased in speed because of human impacts. However, climate change is a natural process that would occur whether or not humans were here. The climate has changed multiple times throughout the billions of years that the planet has existed because of things like the meteor that took out the dinosaurs, because of high volcanic activity, solar maximums and minimums. Things like the Ice Age came about because of that. But right now, due to the constant burning of fossil fuels and putting more and more CO2, which is a greenhouse gas, into the environment, we are seeing some of this climate change occurring at a faster rate than it would have normally. So changes in the climate directly affect ecosystems. And if the ecosystem is affected, then all living organisms within that ecosystem are also going to be affected. So as the climate changes, things like rainfall, things like sunlight availability, temperature, that's all going to affect the organisms living there. And you can see in this graph, this is showing which organisms and how many are at highest risk of extinction from climate change. So it's thought that climate change is driving the risk of extinction for somewhere between 5 to 23% of the species on the planet, depending on which continent you look at, with certain continents bearing a heavier burden than others because they have a higher biodiversity level. So let's look a little bit more, since we've gotten into this topic of climate change, into what are some of the human impacts on ecosystems. So first we have to understand this idea of biodiversity. Biodiversity is just that, the diversity of life. That's what bio means, life. So this is the variety of life in an area determined by the number of species, how many of each species you have, how healthy your ecosystem is overall. Usually the way we think about it is the more species, the more biodiverse your ecosystem. And biodiversity is a good thing because it makes the ecosystem more stable and healthier in the long run, more capable of withstanding changes that are going to come at them from changes in the environment. So we often look at 3 different types of biodiversity, and let's dive into those 3 now. The first one is genetic diversity. This is the variety of the genes of the organisms in a population. So how many different possibilities can I create for one gene? If you look at some organisms, they have one color eye for the whole population, whereas a group like humans, can have blue, we can have green, we can have gray, we can have all these different shades of brown. We have lots of different variations for the eye color gene. The more genes that you have means the more traits you have to pass on to your offspring, and that the higher level of diversity in your genes increases your chances of surviving. If I only have one water tolerance gene in a plant that I'm growing, and suddenly we have a year where there's a little bit of a drought, that could kill off all of those plants all at once. Whereas if different individuals within my crop can tolerate slightly different water availabilities, some can tolerate a little bit more drought, some need a little bit more water, I'm not going to lose all of them in the case of a drought year. I'm going to have some that can make it through and survive to the next year. So having this genetic diversity is kind of like an insurance policy for rapidly changing environments or natural disturbances. So an example of one that's not going so well are cheetahs. So there was a bottleneck, meaning that their population grew incredibly small right after the last ice age. And as a result, they lost a lot of the diversity of their genes. Most cheetahs are highly related to each other. They have very few differences between each cheetah. They're almost all related within a direct, immediate family line. So as a result, one little thing can knock out the cheetah population if it affects all of them. So as a result, they're weaker to the changing climate, they're having a harder time surviving, and as a result, cheetahs are going extinct quite rapidly. Then we have species diversity. This is probably the main thing that we think of when we think of the term biodiversity. How many different types of species live in my community? This is obviously going to vary depending on which biome you're in. The tropical rainforest is going to have significantly higher biodiversity as far as the species compared to the desert. However, we can look at each individual biome and each individual ecosystem and say, does this ecosystem have a good species diversity for the type of ecosystem it is? Because you can have a lot of different species that live in the desert, or you can have a desert area that's been affected and it has fewer species. So just something to think about there. And the last one is ecosystem diversity. This is the diversity in the various different types of ecosystems present on the planet. This is going to be really affected by abiotic factors, and it can also be very impacted by human activity. So when humans over-farm in an area, they deplete the soil of nutrients, and that can lead to something called desertification, where we turn an area into desert, and it becomes unusable for not only humans, but for other plants and animals as well. So we want to maintain as many different types of ecosystems as we can to ensure health of the biosphere, the whole planet as well. So why does biodiversity matter? Well, there's always personal reasons because we live on this planet and we want to enjoy our lives, and having more biodiversity makes this planet a more beautiful place to live on. But there's also logical reasons for wanting to protect biodiversity. So we're going to look at some of those reasons, personal or logical, emotional or logical, that might affect why we want to preserve biodiversity. So the first reason is direct economic value. We depend on all the living organisms in the ecosystems around us, some for food, some like plants because we get useful chemicals from them. We got our original form of aspirin from salicylic acid in the bark of willow trees. We are still finding new antibiotics in various different types of bacteria and fungi that we find in the environment. So if we lose biodiversity and species go extinct, we might be losing that direct economic value from them because we haven't fully realized how we could use them. I know that's a little bit of a grim idea to think about, that we only want to preserve the environment because of its economic value to us and how we can exploit it. But I don't want you to think about it in those terms. Yes, we have to balance overexploitation with use of what's available to us, because in the end, we are living organisms that are learning how to use our environment to allow us to survive. We just have to find that balance between using them for survival, using them for thriving, versus just taking advantage. Then we have the indirect economic value. These are things that we can't exactly monetize and sell. Things like plants removing the CO2 from the atmosphere to give us oxygen to breathe. We can't monetize the oxygen that we breathe, at least not yet, but that is a direct value to us in terms of being able to live. Things like having tree roots keep the soil together to prevent erosion, which could end up causing mudslides that destroy cities and end up killing people. All of this stuff is really important indirectly to us, not things we can directly monetize. But we also have a reason to protect biodiversity because we are more than just logical and economic beings. We do have emotional ties to our environment as well. And biodiversity is aesthetic. It's very, very beautiful. Our world is gorgeous. And by reducing the biodiversity and getting rid of different types of ecosystems, we're losing that beauty and that charm. We find that being in nature can reduce stress, it can reduce chronic illness symptoms, it can even lower the symptomologies of your ADHD if you have that. It improves health overall. So by losing that beauty, you lose some of these other factors that make our lives more livable and make us more healthy. We also use the environment for recreation. It's a lot of fun to be able to go swim in the lake by your house. It's a lot of fun to go up into the mountains and hike or ski or things like that. Losing biodiversity could cause us to lose access to these things that we love. But also scientific value. We have learned so much about what it means to be human, about how our bodies work, and just we're curious as a species, and we turn to our environment and nature and study it to make sense of why we're here and how we can make our lives better. We're also, just want answers about what is going on around us, not necessarily to monetize it or to get a value out of it, but because humans just are innately curious. So by lowering biodiversity, we will lose this aesthetic and scientific value. So there are many threats to biodiversity. Some of them have always existed and will always exist, and we call those more natural threats. But some of them are also anthropogenic. That means man-caused or man-made. Things like overexploitation, habitat loss, leading to things that like fragmentation and edge effects and extinction, pollution, invasive species or introduced species. So let's get into some of these right now. Overexploitation is just the excessive overuse of an animal or an organism that has direct economic value to us, or just value in the sense that they're food. So We often use animals and plants for food, for medicine, for their body parts to make fur and clothing, things like that, decorations, unfortunately. We have, really found orchids to be beautiful, so we take them from their natural environment and keep them here to make our homes look more pretty. And this can lead to the full extinction or near extinction of these species. This image right here, this mound is all buffalo skulls. So there used to be tons of buffalo roaming the plains of America, and it became very in vogue to hunt them, and it was kind of like a status symbol. Yeah, people would eat them as well, but it became a pastime for often the rich and the wealthy, and they would want to kill as many as they could to show off their status. So that led to absolute decimation of the buffalo species on the plains and nearly extinction of the species. So overall, habitat loss or habitat destruction is the main reason causing species extinction today, and it has been in the past as well. So habitat destruction can be things like deforestation. We're cutting down trees in a forest to make room for crops or building new cities. But it can also be natural in the sense of natural disasters like fires or hurricanes or things like that. It may not be a total destruction of the landscape. It could just mean affecting the balance of the species that live in the environment. We talked a little bit about keystone species. If we overhunt the otter, overexploit the otter, or we destroy the otter's habitat and their populations crash, then that keystone species loss results in a destabilization of the entire ecosystem and could potentially lead to more species loss as a result. This is definitely being influenced by climate change. And this is one of the big issues why we need to be aware when we're moving into new areas of how we are disturbing existing habitats. So what ends up happening when we disturb these habitats are things called fragmentation and edge effects. So fragmentation is when we take an ecosystem that's intact and we break it in half or into smaller pieces. So now there is less of a range for some of these organisms to live. And some species require really great distances for their habitat and home range in order to be healthy and thrive. So by fragmenting that, you're breaking down some of that space that these creatures have taken over as their home range. You're also creating more edges. So this leads to things called edge effects, which are environmental conditions that only exist on the edge of an ecosystem, where one ecosystem is transitioning into another. These are often areas that have high disturbance levels. So you're going to see more instability, which makes creatures not want to establish homes there as much. We also see that for some reason at the edges, invasive species tend to do very well. So that can lead to more destruction of the ecosystem around it, further degradation, causing more edges to come up, and these invasive species kind of take over. So what are some of the solutions to these problems of habitat destruction? Well, one of them that pops up over and over again, at least in the United States, is to protect the land. Governments like ours will institute areas as national park lands or national monuments or conservation areas where humans have limited use. They often can't do certain types of recreating. They may not be able to come onto that land at all. They might have to avoid areas because it's a nesting area for an endangered creature, something like that. And these are really fantastic because they do preserve the overall landscape and the overall ecosystem. But that's not to say that there's not downsides to that. That does cause a limitation on where humans can go and what they can do which limits your freedom of choice, which limits where you can move your family. And often people may not be aware of some of these protected lands, and they end up getting prosecuted for things that they may not be aware that they're violating. The other thing we can do are movement corridors. These are building natural structures that are made to mimic the surrounding habitat so that creatures have a safe way to pass from one fragmented area to another. It basically connects the habitats that we have separated from each other. So an example are like wildlife crossings over freeways. They can go over, they can go under. And currently, the biggest one is in existence is being built in the Agora Calabasas area along the 101 freeway. And what this will hopefully do is create a connection point for things like mountain lions to be able to move from the Santa Monica Mountains back to where they've been cut off by the 405 and the 101 freeways. What this allows is more normal passage between habitats by organisms, so they can mate, they can extend their range that may have been decimated in the past. So hopefully this will create some really good results for this area. There are downsides to this as well, of course, a little bit fewer. However, the main one is cost. This particular one is going to cost at least $25 million and multiple years to create. So you're going to see a little bit of a downside in that respect. Now, when we disturb habitats too much, when we overexploit, we can get something called extinction. I've mentioned this a couple times already. This occurs when a species gets so low that they can barely create enough genetic diversity for them to survive, and eventually they will start to diminish in their size until they are completely gone and all members of the species die. So there are many organisms that have been driven to extinction. One of the main ones we think of are the dinosaurs. There was a natural extinction. We had this meteor come in, it landed near the Gulf of Mexico, or in the Gulf of Mexico near the Yucatan Peninsula, and as a result, many of the different types of dinosaur species completely went extinct and mammals were able to thrive. But then some extinctions are a result of human intervention. For example, the thylacine, this creature right here, the Tasmanian tiger. It is a marsupial, so it has a pouch like a kangaroo, and they were driven to extinction because of hunting and because of habitat loss. There's some people out there who claim that they do believe there are a few wild ones left, but really we have not seen a living thylacine since the last one died in a zoo, I believe in the 1930s. So it's been a while. They're most likely extinct. Things like the passenger pigeon, we ate that one to death. The woolly mammoth went extinct because of the climate was changing, the ice age was ending, so they no longer had their colder climate to thrive in, and that allowed humans to break into their habitat a little bit more, leading to overexploitation and hunting. The dodo was overhunted. There's a lot of different examples of this. Another thing that we mentioned briefly is pollution. This is any changes in the material found in the air, the soil, or the water. Often these are toxic chemicals, or the amount that we dump them in becomes toxic. So an example is when we have a lot of fertilizer, that fertilizer often runs off when it rains, and that can end up going into our natural waterways, and it causes things like eutrophication. Basically what happens is this pond or this water area has such high nitrogen levels that there is an overgrowth, an absolute explosion of algae in that pond or in that body of water. The algae grow so quickly and so out of control because they have all this fertilizer as a nutrient source that they end up using up all of the oxygen in that body of water. And as a result, anything dependent on oxygen in that body of water dies of suffocation. And you end up with these bodies of water that end up completely dead because all of the life has been killed by this algal bloom. And eventually the algae die as well because they've exhausted all the nutrients, and it becomes this totally lifeless body of water. Another example that can occur is when we've polluted certain chemicals, it can go back up into the atmosphere and result in acid rain. And that acid rain can then remove calcium and potassium and other nutrients from the soil that are needed by plants and animals, and it can disrupt the nutrient balance in that soil. So some things we can do to combat some of our pollution problems lie in this idea of bioremediation, so using living things to fix pollution or environmental problems. An example is planting sunflowers. After nuclear incidences, if there's ever types of radiological spillover, what happens is people will often put sunflowers around that area because sunflowers can actually take the radiation out of the soil and kind of neutralize it. We also use bacteria to clean up oil spills in the ocean, like the Deepwater Horizon that happened, I believe, in 2010. And then we have this threat that is often human-driven, and that is invasive or introduced species. These are non-native species that are moved from their home to a different ecosystem where they don't normally exist. This often causes them to flourish because they don't have natural predators or because they have a better ability to tap into the nutrients in the area compared to local organisms. And this can lead to massive habitat changes. So things like the kudzu vines, the rabbits in Australia that we talked about, all of those are examples of invasive species. And finally, what can we do to protect biodiversity? The first one is conservation. This is basically the protection of land or organisms from human exploitation. We can manage our resources properly. Instead of just indiscriminately deforesting, we can, plan things out better, do better city planning so we don't end up taking more of the forest than we need to, disrupting that ecosystem, things like that. We can build more of these corridors for animals to pass between fragmented areas. The identification and monitoring of species is a really big one because we can see what changes that we implement are helping versus hurting. We can do that bioremediation to remove pollutants, protect land by creating reserves. Hunting is also an interesting way that you can conserve. If you put or if you're having issues with too many predators in an area or too many prey species that's leading to imbalances that's destroying the ecosystem, you can actually allow hunting of that species. Another way is to actually earn money by allowing people to hunt certain animals. So currently, actually, coyotes are a huge invasive problem in many areas of the United States. And so places like Virginia have really high bounties on coyote hides because the coyotes are decimating the ecosystems out there. So you can go and hunt coyote and turn in their bodies and get a reward for it. Or you can hunt older organisms that are near death that are good prizes because they have big, antlers or some other type of desired quality. And you can charge these people tens of thousands of dollars or sometimes even hundreds of thousands of dollars to hunt this particular organism. And as a result, all that money you take in often will go back to conservation efforts. So it's kind of like a fundraising opportunity. You can do biological augmentation, which is how we talked about reintroducing the wolves to Yellowstone that replaced their keystone species status, and it caused all of Yellowstone to flourish. We can legally protect lands by preventing certain types of human activities on those lands, but most importantly is education. None of these things will happen unless you educate people to the existing problem and to the possible solutions. You have to allow people to decide for themselves which of these conservation options are best for their particular community, because it might not be the same for every community. And that's it for today. Thanks for paying attention and listening.